So last time you all were in here, I started talking a bit about the allegory of the cave, actually some background on Socrates. And then it expressed some nostalgia of the great PowerPoints of my past, the one I did. So I made a PowerPoint. It's not done yet, but the good news is I'll finish it in sections so that by the time we get to where we're supposed to be, it will be done at that point. So let's see how it works. So from last time, have these phrases down. So and the forms is the really big takeaway from Socrates' philosophy. And you're going to find that I'm going to use Socrates and Plato kind of interchangeably. Because, as I'm going to explain, Socrates never wrote anything down. He wasn't a literary philosopher. He was perhaps in the vein of what we call the Cynics. He was essentially a guy who lived his philosophy. And he believed that philosophy should not be written down, but instead philosophy should be lived. And then when you live the philosophy, you may gain students, or at least you'll gain people who will imitate your behavior because they think it's the proper way to live. So in other words, philosophy should be something practical. It should explain how we should live, and it should give us the mechanisms to live that way. And then he believed that if a person lived their philosophy, that others would be inspired to do the same, and that's how philosophy would get passed down through the generations. Not by writing it down, but by living it. And if it was something that was worth living, that people would therefore live it. And so it wouldn't have a need to be written down. So you're going to hear me use Socrates and Plato interchangeably. So the question issue, as I mentioned last time, how do we know what we know? How do we know what we know? So when I ask you, like, how do you know today is Monday? Or how do you know which room you're in? How do you know my name? How do you know that 2 plus 2 even equals 4? It's not a small question. In fact, as we're going to see, there's a whole study around it called epistemology. And epistemology comes from the Greek word episteme, which means knowledge, and then ology, the study of. And so it's not a small thing. Even when we're looking at like science, we might say, well, I believe in science. Fantastic. So how do you know what you know? Well, science tells me. Okay, great. So how do you know what you know? In other words, how is it that science delivers information? How is it that science retrieves information? And I mean that specifically, how science retrieves information, not even discovers. But how is it that science retrieves information? And if you go into the hard sciences, or even into liberal arts, this is going to be a question that's going to be very important to you. How do you know what you know? And the more focused that we can think of it that way, the more focused our studies can be. Hopefully that'll make more sense as we go. In other words, it's not just some like belly button scratching, navel gazing philosophical question, how we know what we know. How you think you know what you know will determine first off what you can know, and it will determine the direction in which you live your life. So as I mentioned last time, Sigmund Freud was a materialist. So remember I talked a bit about him when we were talking about Carl Jung. And I said that Sigmund Freud, because he was a materialist, he believed that all that existed in the universe is physical matter. That there's nothing spiritual, there's nothing like a soul, there's only physical matter. So because he believed that, he could never have discovered something, like the collective unconscious. Because the collective unconscious, by definition, is non-material. So because he had this epistemology that said, all that exists to be discovered, all that we can possibly retrieve from the universe, happens in this very specific paradigm. That means that anything that happens outside this paradigm can never be discovered by that person. This is one of the reasons it's important to keep an open mind, to diversify your personality. Because there are parts of your knowledge system that will only ever be able to discover like physical things, physical matter, if you believe that. If you are more open-minded, and open-minded doesn't mean that you believe all things. It means that you're open to hearing and learning from all things. An open-minded person will say, yeah, physical matter, but maybe there's a spiritual, maybe there's a soul. Even if you don't believe it's ever been proven, even if you think it's unlikely, it's a matter of keeping your mind open so that if this thing exists, you can experience it. It isn't, again, believing all things, but keeping an open mind so that you can. And so This is why the epistemological approach is important. Also, by the way, because because Carl Jung believed in the spiritual, he believed in the possibility of the spiritual, he believed in the collective unconscious, it was that openness that allowed him to discover it. Now, if it's not true, then it's also the thing that caused him to lead his whole life chasing rabbit trails of things that are untrue. This is why it's important to have kind of these both sides. The four processes we looked at last time: materialism, empiricism, idealism, and rationalism. Make sure that you have these things down. Materialism. The idea that nothing exists except for physical matter. Nothing exists, and I'm talking about in the universe. Nothing exists in the universe except for physical matter. Things that we can touch, taste, smell. And the important thing is that it's a lens through which we seek and interpret information. So it's kind of like a foundational point that we begin with. We begin by saying, nothing exists in the universe except for physical matter. And if we believe that, then that will color how we can investigate knowledge, how we can investigate information, how we can understand things. So materialism, nothing exists except for physical matter. Nothing exists except for physical matter. And again, it's important to consider that it's the lens. It's kind of like a foundational belief, we call it an axiom, through which we interpret all information, through which we interpret all experience. Right. Next, empiricism. Empiricism. This is the belief that all knowledge is derived through sense experience, the five senses. This is the foundation of the Western scientific method. The idea that experiments have to be observable, they have to be repeatable over and over and over again. So in other words, the scientific method would be something like, if I take this pen, it's a precise V5 extra fine pilot pen, and it's green, and I'm going to hold it from a height of, let's say, I don't know, 6 feet. That's about 6 feet, right? About here? Yeah. Okay, good. And if I'm going to let this thing go from 6 feet high, drop it, and go, okay, so it falls. In order for that experiment to align with the scientific method, I have to be very precise, as I said. It's a green, precise V5. I have to get the weight exactly so that somebody in Cambodia can carry out the exact same experiment and get the exact same results. That's the scientific method. It has to be repeatable, and it can't just be from 6 feet 5 inches. It has to be from 6 feet. It has to be this specific pen. Now, we might find that our findings will apply to all different pens in all different countries and all that. That's fun. But in order for something to be scientifically verifiable or empirically verifiable, that's the process that we go through. So again, all knowledge is derived from sense experience, your five senses. So this goes back to last time I was asking, how do you know what you know? And we were told, well, you can see it for yourself. Somebody will tell you so you hear it. Yeah, why not? Oh, man. Last week, fourth period, I was talking during the quote, and someone kept farting.
Ew.
Yeah, and it was like rank, man. And I watched myself in the video afterwards, and I'm like, man, what a professional. I didn't let on one single bit, and it was terrible. And then finally it would dissipate, and I'm thinking the whole time, why are we supposed to have air filters in these rooms now? You know, God, forget COVID, get this thing out of here. And then a couple months go by, finally it would dissipate, and then it would happen again. And I was just like, man, somebody in here has been eating some horrible stuff. How do I know? From the sense of smell. And I have almost no sense of smell. So the fact that I even smelled that was, I felt bad for everybody else who was around here.
Damn.
Yeah, it's terrible. And I have my suspicions, but
Just that one food.
there's always that one you sit and go, it's you, isn't it? So sensory experience. Next, idealism. Idealism, all knowledge is derived from the mind. Thanks, Kim. This goes back to the idea that my PowerPoint is as of yet unedited. Idealism is, not idealism, empiricism. Idealism is the foundation, that's not true. Ignore everything below the mind. I'll edit that out of the video. So all knowledge is derived from the mind. All knowledge is derived from the mind. As we're going to see, Socrates and Plato were idealists. And what that means is that you come to truth. I'm talking about true truth, not pragmatic truth. So for example, there are pragmatic truths, which means that something just works. It might not be true, but it works. So we use it. So for example, anybody in here taking physics or taking physics? Good. Okay. So what you're going to realize is that when you get really good at physics and you start to learn how everything kind of mechanically works, your professor is going to throw a big wrench in there and say, hey, it's not just physics, by the way. It's quantum physics as well. And then you start learning about quantum physics. And what you're going to quickly realize is that physics and quantum physics contradict each other. Say it again. Physics and quantum physics contradict each other. In other words, the things that we believe are the laws that rule physics, all physical matter in the universe, are contradicted by things that we think rule the subatomic level. You see the problem with this? What that means is that the universe shouldn't be here. It shouldn't be here. Because these two things contradict each other and they can't both be true. So what's the problem? We don't know. We don't know if we'll ever find out. I mean, it's still relatively new. The point is that we use it because it works, though. In other words, we don't sit there and go, well, we know that physics is somehow flawed. So you know what? Until we figure it out, stop flying all airplanes. It's not the way it works. We sit there and go, we'll figure it out somehow, some way. So some knowledge is just practical. It's pragmatic. It just works. And we would say that's not really knowledge. It's just a strong belief that we have, as we're going to see. But instead, idealism is a process through which you come to truth simply by contemplating. In other words, it doesn't require the pen. It doesn't require anything physical. In fact, as we're going to see, there's a huge problem with idealism, which we're going to look at. Then lastly, rationalism. Rationalism. Knowledge is derived from sense experience and the mind. So rationalism is empiricism plus idealism. So you learn from both. This would be like Carl Jung. A strict idealist would say, no, you can't learn through your five senses. And we're going to see why in just a minute. But a strict idealist would say you cannot learn through your five senses. You can't gain true knowledge through your five senses. But a rationalist would say you can get true knowledge through your five senses and through your mind. Simply rationally thinking about things. Because to sit and think is to tap into your soul. To sit and think is to tap into your soul. In other words, did I talk last time when we were looking at the quote from Irving Yalom? Did I talk about mountains and high spaces and stuff like that? Yeah. Okay, good. One thing I don't think I mentioned, at least I didn't hit on it very hard, was the idea of solitude. Solitude is to separate yourself from the world. And it's not just so that you're not influenced by the world, which is true. It's also so you can slow down the world, so you can understand it. It's both of these things together. That's why it's good to go off by yourself. You can kind of think at your own pace. You can slow things down, think about things in retrospect, not in real time. And also, you're not being influenced by other people trying to talk to you. You've been working on something, and someone keeps talking to you. Yeah, it happens all the time. Imagine if you're sitting there thinking about it, and it looks like you're doing it. I mean, people are already, if you're on your phone, people will still walk up to you. Hey, what you doing? It's pretty obvious, right? And then people will still, you might say, oh, I'm trying to send this really important message. Oh, yeah. So how's your day so far? And they'll start talking to you. Now, if you're sitting there trying to contemplate some deep idea, it's even harder. So you have to separate yourself from people. And it gives you the opportunity to do that. Idealism is that you can contemplate these things as they truly are. Because to separate yourself is to think deeply. To think deeply is to access your soul. as we're going to see. So, questions so far? All right. So we have a problem. We have a couple of problems. If it's true that all of our knowledge comes from the five senses, in other words, if empiricism is true, there's some things that we have to grapple with. First off, our senses are often deceived. Our senses are often deceived. Have you ever been walking down the hallway and you thought you heard your name? So you turn and you stop and you look, but no one said your name? Yeah. You ever? Oh, here's one. You ever keep your phone in your pocket? You keep feeling it buzz, and then you keep checking it, but there's no message. You put it back, check again. That's because your senses are often deceived. If you take your arm and you put it into a bucket of water or into a swimming pool, what happens to your arm? Besides getting wet. What's that?
It gets cold.
It gets cold. And what does it look like happens to your arm?
Like it's rolling, that hairs, well, my hairs.
Starts to float?
Oh.
Yeah. You ever look at it and it looks like your arm has bent? Yeah, it's because of the refraction. It has to do with how it is, refraction of the water. Long story. But when you stick your arm in that pool, does your arm actually break?
No.
You know, is it actually doing this? You know, that'd be weird. You put your arm in the water, every time you put your arm in the water, it breaks, and you scream in pain, then you pull it out, and it's fine. And you think, well, I'll never... That's why I don't drink water. That's why I only drink Diet Coke. It's dangerous. That is that obviously your arm is not breaking. It just looks like it is. So your senses are deceived. Now, you can explain and go, oh, but here's why it's deceived. Well, again, that has to do with using your mind to rationally understand why your perceptions are flawed. It doesn't unflaw your perceptions. It just tells you why your perceptions are flawed so that you can ideally understand it. This would be an example of rationalism. You're putting those two things together so you can understand why your arm looks that way. You can understand. So if I explained to you why it is when you walked down the hallway you thought you heard your name, now you can understand it. But that doesn't stop you from hearing it. Any of you guys, when you're sitting there, you feel like something crawling on you? Like right now, if you're thinking about it? And your immediate reaction is like to smack your arm and you look to see what it was? Man, what if it was like, I don't know, your friend? Hey, what's up? And you just smacked him in the face. Try this. When you feel something like crawling on you, stop and look first. And here's what you're going to find most of the time. Nothing. There's just something going on with your skin that makes it feel like something's crawling on you. But if every time you look, you kind of smack your arm, that's your reaction, you never actually know if there was something or not. You kind of feed into the idea of always smacking your arm when you feel it. Instead, if you can look at it and realize there's nothing there, and always look first, even if it's on your face. You know, take a look before you try to clear off your face, because then you can understand why it is that that's happening. But again, it doesn't undeceive your senses. It only tells you why it's happening. So this is a huge problem, because if our senses are often deceived, it makes it very difficult to get true knowledge through our five senses. How do you know when your senses are telling the truth, and how do you know when they're lying? You don't. And then next, we seem to know concepts that we've never experienced before. So for example, none of you have ever experienced something that was truly perfect, something that was truly without flaw. But we have an idea of what perfection is. None of us have ever experienced infinity directly with our bodies. And yet somehow we have a concept of infinity. Now these are things, or even justice. Has anybody ever sat down and explained to you what justice is? Probably not. But you probably have an idea of what justice is without someone explaining it to you. And yet you've never experienced it in its truest form. So it doesn't make sense that you'd have an understanding of what it is. Let this sink into your head for a little bit, because it's a difficult idea. Because if I ask that question, how do you know infinity is? I just know. Or I just learned this from somewhere. You could, but the idea is that we stand on the shoulders of giants, meaning that all of our knowledge comes from people who came before us. So, for example, the idea that you're influenced by your early childhood experiences. Again, this goes back to Sigmund Freud. Before Freud, this wasn't common knowledge. We look at it today and we're like, yeah, duh, of course. You know, nothing else makes sense. Well, it didn't make sense for 300,000 years of human experience. But all of a sudden, this one Austrian comes along with a cigar, asks people how they feel about their mothers, and then suddenly he says, oh, those early childhood experiences impact who you are today. And that was less than 100 years ago. We only recently discovered this. But to us today, we're like, oh my God, people are so stupid. How did they not know that? Do you really think you'd have come to that understanding without Sigmund Freud? Because there are things that your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren are going to say, duh, yeah, obviously. How did my great-great-grandma not know that? Those truths are out there right now. We haven't retrieved them yet. And so if it's so obvious to us that early childhood experiences impact our later life behavior, then what great truth that your great-great-grandparents, your great-great-grandchildren are going to understand are you not discovering right now? Because it's out there. My point is that we have this tendency to just look at this and go, well, it's perfection, of course. Of course I have an understanding of what infinity is. Of course I have but there is no of course about it. Again, if it's true that all of our knowledge comes through our five senses, in other words, if all that exists in the world is physical material, and if the only thing that we can know is stuff that we've experienced with our five senses, you've never experienced infinity with your five senses. You've never experienced perfection or justice or even love, really, with your five senses. So the question becomes, how do you know these things? And it's not a trivial answer. As we're going to see, Socrates argues that the very fact that you know what those things are indicates that you have an immortal soul. In fact, not that you have an immortal soul, that you are an immortal soul. If you remember the analogy of the car, when you're driving down the street, you're not the car. You're the person driving the car. When your car crashes, you get out and you leave. Think of your car as your body, and you as the actual you, the psyche. An important distinction. True belief. A true belief is something, it's a belief that someone holds and happens to be true. And Socrates argues that this is most of what we have. We have beliefs that are true. They're true beliefs. But it isn't knowledge. And he distinguishes between true belief and knowledge. He distinguishes between true belief and knowledge. So, an example of true belief. If you're babysitting, I don't know, however old this is, a little kid, and you teach 7? That's 7?
No, that's like 4.
That's
4.
like 6, 5.
So somewhere between 4 and 7, I guess we're hearing.
This boy's a little shorter. 5. That's like 5.
That's
This is 5.
5, 6.
All right, who has the most siblings? Can speak as an expert.
I'm the youngest.
Who's got 5 or more siblings? Can speak as an. How old is this? How old? 4. So, all right, we have an expert. So let's say you got a 4-year-old.
That's a monster, bro.
Truth has been spoken. This is a 4-year-old. We now know.
Too many titty milk. I'm sorry.
That's nice. So we have a 4-year-old, and you teach this 4-year-old a song, and it goes something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the kid just sits at you and blinks his eyes. And you say again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. By the 3rd or 4th time you're doing that, the little kid's going, the little 4-year-old's going, and singing along with you. Maybe by the 100th time, the little kid is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Whatever. All right, so far so good? All right. So now, you go to that 4-year-old and you say, all right, what's 1 plus 2? What is the kid's answer probably going to be? 3. Why? 1, 2, 3, because 3 comes after 2 in the song. So you ask the child, what is 1 plus 2? And the little kid just goes, 3. And you go, oh my gosh, this kid's a genius. I taught this kid math. And those kids sitting there going, and then you say to the kid, all right. What is 4 plus 5? And the kid says, 6! And you go, oh, never mind. It's stupid. All right, put it back with the others. Put him down in the basement with others. How many 4-year-olds does it take to change a light bulb?
I think you said this one.
Yeah.
I forgot that.
More than 7, because my basement's still dark.
You have so many light bulbs.
Anyway, the idea is that
I knew it.
a kid doesn't know, a little kid like that doesn't know math, but the kid has a belief that 1 plus 2 equals 3. And the belief is true, 1 plus 2 does equal 3. But the kid doesn't have knowledge of how to do math. Socrates would argue that a lot of what we call knowledge is exactly that. It's a belief we have, and it may even be a true belief. But it isn't knowledge. Knowledge, as he says, is that a person, first off, has to be able to define a concept. So if I ask you, what is justice? What is justice? And you answer whatever you answer. The idea is that I can ask you a bunch of questions about justice, and you can stand up to questioning. You ever have and I'm not talking about the 4-year-old who now you ask the 4-year-old, well, 1 plus 2 equals 3. Why? Because, why? Why? That isn't questioning. The little kid who keeps asking why isn't real questioning. It means that you can explain it, fully, detailedly. So you have to be able to define a concept in order to demonstrate a true knowledge about it. And you're going to find out, Socrates says, that this only happens after a type of experience. After a type of experience. Questions about this so far?